Let me share my screen with you and then we'll start. Okay. So
Sir,
we,
could you please send
yeah.
me feedback?
Yes. It's been really crazy, but yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that today, inshallah. Right? Okay. So I'll open it. Basically, I keep waiting for my laptop, and then I forget there's so many other things. I'll give you feedback over my phone. Right? That makes it more workable. Okay. Now, students, quick overview before we jump to the past paper question, right? So what are market structures? Market structures are study of different type of markets to determine the level of competition that exists, right? So can you see my screen? So there are four market structures that are part of our syllabus, right? And that includes perfect competition, monopoly, as you can see on the screen, oligopoly, and monopolistic competition. So far, we have covered perfect competition, monopoly, and monopolistic competition, right? So this fourth one, oligopoly, is what we are left with, and that is what we will cover. Yesterday, I was telling you, if you remember, characteristics of these markets, right? And I did tell you that I will just quickly go over it and you will have access to all the notes. So these are the notes I was talking about. So what are the characteristics of perfect competition? You can read in detail. If there's any question, you can ask me later on and so on, right? And all definitions are also included and everything, right? Monopoly we have also covered, right? Just to quickly show you that most competition exists in perfect competition. That's what the name suggests. And least competition exists in monopoly, right? Okay, now this being said, and then monopolistic competition has relatively more competition. That's why it's towards perfect competition side, like on the left, and oligopoly has relatively lesser competition, and therefore it is to the right, closer towards monopoly. Okay, then what are the characteristics of monopoly? You can find all of that over here, and then today we will do, and in the end you will see monopolistic competition as well, right? But today we have to do oligopoly. Now, what is oligopoly, students? Okay, now oligopoly is a market where there are few big players, and they have captured the entire market. Now, let me ask you, let's start off by asking you a simple question. Can you tell me that how many firms, can you imagine or think about how many firms provide airline services, or how many airline businesses are there in entire world? Like if you include airline businesses of all the countries, right? So what would be the total number of that thing? And if you compare that number of airlines in this world that are currently operational with something as the number of number of brands that you find in clothing market, or the number of brands or the number of firms that you find in consumer hygiene goods that they tell you, like shampoo, soaps, and so on, right? So I mean, which one is several? I mean, there are obviously a couple of players, but still, if you compare that with something as clothing brands. So would you expect more firms to be present in clothing market, or lesser firms to be present in clothing market compared to a market like airline industry? That's the question. So compared to an airline industry in your country, or overall, if we want to talk about the world, we can also do that. In which business, clothing industry, would you see more firms, more companies producing that, or airline? Right. Clothing, you would expect more, right? Right? In clothing, you will expect more. Why? Think about this. The idea is fairly simple, that entry barriers in clothing market are not that high as compared to the airline industry. Why? Airline industry requires a lot of investment. I mean, each aeroplane is like millions and millions of dollars, right? Second thing that you need to have to operate an airline is to get clearance from all the countries where you would want to operate. You have to get clearance from their airports and things like that. So there is a lot of regulation involved in that market, right? So that's what makes it difficult to start an airline industry. Yes or no, right? So similarly, another example I'll give, and then we move forward with this. Think of companies that explore oil in the world, right? So think about oil stations, gas stations, right, in your own country. How many brands can you think of, right? So there would be Shell. Shell is an international company that you see in every country of the world, then there might be one or two local firms, don't know, right? So in Pakistan, there is Pakistan State Oil, which is government-owned business, PSO we call that, and there are two or three more players, right? So why are there so few? Great, yes, exactly. Why are there so limited companies exploring oil in our country and similarly in other countries as well? Because it's difficult to set up such a business that explores oil. Why? It requires a lot of investment. You need to get your regulations approved. Like, just imagine the machinery that they used to first research whether oil exists in certain part of the world, and then to extract that oil is millions of dollars worth of equipment, right? Which not obviously everyone can, every company can afford, right? So that's why you will see fewer firms. So that is, these types of markets are defined as oligopoly markets. So how do we define it? Markets where product is complicated and or expensive to produce, and therefore there are few large firms, right? Four, five, six, not more than that. That's what an oligopoly market is. Markets like telecommunication, airline industry, oil and gas industry are the ones that would be classified as oligopoly, which we have already talked about. Characteristics of oligopoly. Now, this is where it becomes a little tricky. Few large firms that have captured big market share. So every firm has a relatively higher market share because, I mean, if there are only 5 or 6 firms, so you can just do the maths yourself, 100% market share divided by that 5, 6 firms, every firm will have relatively big chunk, 15, 16, 17%, like that, right? There are relatively high entry barriers. Now, this is something that you need to know, obviously. Why there are few firms? The very reason there are few firms in the market is that entry barriers are high, making it difficult for new firms to enter, right? In terms of producing a technologically complicated product, right? So think about this. Extracting oil is no easy thing, right? You have to do a lot of research to first identify regions within a country where oil exists, and then extracting it, refining it, refinery, oil refinery. This is a technical process. Same goes for airline industry, right? I mean, millions of worth of dollars are the planes that you have to acquire. Then you have to get your regulations done, get approvals to operate in different countries and all that stuff, right? And the amount of investment needed to set up operations. So why are entry barriers high? Either the product is technologically complicated or it requires huge investment, right? So then most of the times the nature of the product produced by firms in oligopoly is homogeneous. Now, homogeneous is the word that we used in perfect competition as well. Homogeneous, if you're not sure, similar, right? So similar products, not always, but most of the times. So if you think about oil, the oil that we use, or petrol or diesel, whatever you want to call it, that we use in our cars, that has same chemical composition regardless of whichever part of the world we are. And if you, whether you buy your petrol from Shell company or PSO or any other company, it will have same chemical composition, right? So that is what makes it homogeneous. Making sense, right? Okay. Now, then another thing is that there is price rigidity. Now, this is very important, and I will explain you with the help of a graph. There is a price rigidity which prevents a single firm to change product price, right? Now, let's come to the graph and let's look at what do we mean by this characteristic. There is price rigidity. Now, this is a very important, what do we call, important characteristic of oligopoly markets. Now, students, think about this. So the demand curve for firms in oligopoly markets is known as kinked demand curve. Now, what is this kinked demand curve? Let's have a look at this, right? So it has a kink. It has a kink, right? So as you know, for any demand curve, you will have price on the y-axis. What's the price per unit of the good? And you have quantity demanded on the x-axis, right? Now, there is a kink in the demand curve, which looks like this, right? So it's less steep on the top end, and then it's less steep on the top end, and then it's more steep at the bottom, right? Now, this is what this bend in this demand curve is known as kink, right? And that's why the demand, we call this demand curve kinked demand curve, right? So why is there a kink? Kinked, let me write this down for you. Kinked demand curve. Okay, now this kink in the demand curve of oligopoly firms show that there is price rigidity. Now, what does price rigidity means? Price rigidity means that no single firm can change price on its own. Why so? Let me explain you, right? Now you have to listen to this very carefully and try to apply this to a real life example. So in this case, let's assume, oil and gas market, right? Where we were taking examples of oil exploration companies, which includes, as I told you, Shell, right? And then there is in Pakistan, there is Pakistan State Oil. In your country, there might be some local firm operating as well. Then there is Total. Total is also an international, multinational company. So you must know of it, Total. And then there are a few other, oil exploration companies, right? So let's say that total of 3 or 4, right? Not more than that, right? And so on, right? Okay. Now, this being said, now think about this. The product, which is oil, is homogeneous, similar product, right? Chemical composition of petrol, whether you buy from Shell or PSO or Total, it should be same, right? Now, if we think of one company at a time, Shell, right? Now, currently, let's say prices are prevailing at 100 rupees per liter, right? In Pakistan, let's say it's much higher than this, by the way, right? Now, what options you have as a business, right? With price, every firm has only 2 options, either to increase the price of its good or to decrease the price of its good. So if you increase your price, students, if this company thinks of increasing its price, now what challenges it will face? Let's talk about it, right? Other firms, your competitors, might not increase their prices. Why? Because if you are increasing prices, you're talking about Shell in this case. So if Shell company is increasing the price of fuel, then other companies most probably will not follow Shell. Why? Because they want to keep their prices low and attract Shell's customers. So they would want to attract Shell's customers, right? So what's the fear Shell has when it increases its price? That it might lose its customers to its competitors. That's what it's afraid of, right? And therefore it might not increase its price. On the other hand, if you think about the other option of reducing the price. So if Shell wants to reduce the price of its fuel, then what will that do? Other firms will also want to reduce the price of their product, right? Reduce the price of their fuel. If Shell has done that, why? Because they also want to stay competitive. They don't want to lose their customers to Shell, because if Shell is charging something lesser now and other firms are charging higher, then obviously it's very obvious to understand that, customers of other companies will start going to Shell because Shell is selling cheaper fuel for the same fuel, but at a cheaper price. Are you getting me? Now, since neither of these 2 options are workable, neither you can increase your price nor you can decrease your price. So that's why the prices stay rigid around this level. That's what the kink demand curve shows, that there's price rigidity around the level where there's a kink. How many of you are getting this? Did you get this right? So what's the fear? If you increase price, you might lose your customers to your competitors. That's why no company does that in oligopoly. And if you reduce price, the fear is that that can result in price war. What is price war? Price war is when you reduce your price and your competitors reduce their prices, and then eventually all firms are reducing their prices, and that is just affecting your profits, right? Right. So Amna, quickly, right? So the idea is fairly simple, that there's a kink in the demand curve, right? So there's this kink, which means that there's a bend in the demand curve, which shows that prices will be rigid around that level, right? So the way you draw that is that on the top part, it's less steep. On the top part, it's less steep, and then on the bottom part, it's more steep, right? So that's how it looks like. Now, this bend in the demand curve shows that there is price rigidity in oligopoly markets, and prices will stay around this level. And why will prices stay around this level? I think I've given detailed explanation that, if you increase price, the fear is that other companies will also, if you increase your price, the fear is that other companies might not increase their price, and therefore you will lose your customers to your competitors, right? That's the fear. And if you reduce your price, the fear is that other companies will also reduce their prices because they also want to stay competitive, and in the process there will be a price war. You are getting lower profits because your product prices are lower, they are also getting lower profits, so no one is really getting a benefit out of that. Is this making sense, students? Right, so that is what the concept
Sir?
of, yeah.
So, sir,
Yes.
point where the graph is, that is the point where they will reduce the price further?
No, they will not. No, rigidity means that prices will stay at that level. So prices in oligopoly will stay at this level, whatever this level is, right? So let's say 100 rupees per liter or whatever, because neither increasing prices an option nor reducing prices an option. That's why prices are rigid. They don't move. They kind of stay fixed for long periods. That's what it shows, right? So prices are rigid around this level. Neither companies increase their price, nor
Yes.
reduce. Great. Okay. Now moving forward, students, have a look at this. Then the fifth and the last point, last characteristic of oligopoly market is that to overcome the problem of price rigidity, the firms in oligopoly markets are very likely to collude, right? The firms in, have a look at this one more time, to avoid the problem of price rigidity. Firms are aware of this problem of price rigidity, and therefore what they do is that they will want to form a collusion. Now, what is this collusion? Let's quickly talk about this. So collusion is when firms, firms sign some sort of agreement, right? And they act as single producer. They sign some agreement and they act as a single producer. Now, what do we mean by a single producer, right? Now, have you guys ever heard the word cartel, right? So there is a cartel, international cartel or world cartel of oil producing companies, right? There is one, right? So all major oil producing countries in the world have formed a cartel. So they have formed an organization where they collectively decide how much oil to produce, like how much oil to extract. Are you getting me? Drug cartels, exactly. Now, you must have definitely heard the word drug cartel, right? But cartel is a basically economic term, which means when all firms that produce a similar product, they act as a single unit. Now think about this. Drugs technically should not be expensive if they are not illegal. Firstly, drugs are illegal. That's what makes them expensive. And secondly, on top of that, all drug producing companies, or we shouldn't be saying them companies, but all drug producing businesses act as a single producer so that they can control the supply of that product, reduce its supply, and to artificially make it expensive. That's what the purpose of a cartel is. Now, the way this works, students, that's what collusion is. When you act as a single producer, you act together, all producers act together, and they operate as a single entity. Right? Easy? We good on this? Okay. Now, to form a collusion, there are two ways of going around this. To form a collusion, there are two ways of going around this, right? Either there is explicit collusion, or there is implicit collusion, right? Now, what's the difference between the two? Let's have a look at this, right? Okay, forget about this. Okay, now explicit collusion is, let's talk about this, right? So explicit collusion is basically cartel. Now, what happens in this? In this, companies have signed a contract, right? Is when there is a publicly known agreement between companies that they will collectively set their prices and output. That's what a cartel is, right? So if you just go and Google OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Now, these countries are the major, countries that produce oil in the world, and they have formed a cartel, and therefore they control world oil prices, right? So I just want to show we're the member countries, right? So think about this. These 14 or 15 countries, right, are the ones that control the world oil supply, right? Algeria, Angola, Gabon, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Congo, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Venezuela, right? So what they are trying to do is that they try to make their product less available, reduce supply, and when you obviously reduce supply, that increases the prices of um, that reduces the price, that increases the price of that product, right? Now that is explicit collusion, or that's known as cartel. Opposite, or another way of going around this, is forming an implicit collusion. Now think about this. Collusion is always illegal regardless of whichever country you are in, right? um, Cartel exactly, that makes the product demand inelastic because supply is less, and therefore people are obviously, given the nature of the good, especially if the nature of the good is necessity, it's important, then consumers will be willing to pay a higher price for that, right? Easy. So that's what they're trying to do, so that they can make more profit out of it. As simple as that. Now, another way of making a collusion apart from cartel or explicit collusion is implicit collusion or price leadership. Now, what I was saying here, that since cartel is always illegal, collusion is always illegal regardless of the country that you are in. Now, to avoid being caught, what do companies do? That they form a price leadership. And what's price leadership? Out of, have a look at this. Out of the firms that are part of collusion, one firm is selected as the leader, and therefore whatever price that firm charges, other firms follow, right? So other firms are just following that price leader, whoever it is, right? In price leadership, it is difficult for regulatory bodies to identify collusion, right? Now, what are regulatory bodies? Every country in the world has its regulatory bodies, which often go by the name of Competition Commission, Pakistan, Competition Commission, UK, and so on and so forth, right? Now, what they do is their task is to identify that there's no illegal practice going on, right? There's no illegal. Competition Commission Pakistan, Competition Commission UK, and similarly other countries have their own regulatory bodies. So their objective is to make sure that there is no illegal practice going on. Students, is this making sense? Right? Okay. Now, that being said, when you are doing price leadership, it's difficult for regulatory bodies to identify this collusion. Why? Because there is no hardcore evidence. Since there's no hardcore evidence of price leadership, that's why it makes it difficult for regulatory bodies to identify collusion. Is this making sense, students? Right? So that's overall what oligopoly market is, right? Now we'll quickly look at the graph for oligopoly market, and then we'll come to a question, right? Now we have already looked at the nature of, we have already looked at demand curve. So for the firm in oligopoly, the demand curve looks like this, that we have talked about, right? There's a kink in the demand curve, right? Easy. Okay. Now what you need to do is to, first of all, make that demand curve, right? So that's how it goes. Yes.
This demand curve is going to be the average revenue curve as well, right?
Yes, average revenue. So demand curve for all firms show its average revenue. That means like how much is average revenue is basically simply the price. So how much is the price of each unit at a certain point? I'll explain in more detail later on. But yeah, every demand curve for all the markets, the demand curve shows average revenue, right? So what you should remember, that this is your demand curve, which shows you the price, and that also is showing you the average, that also shows you your average revenue, right? And this is not only true for oligopoly, but this is true for all markets. All markets demand curve show you average revenue. Is this clear, students? Are we good? Okay. Now on the y-axis, as always for every market structure, as you know, you have price slash cost. On the y-axis, how much is the price of the good and how much is the cost, And on the x-axis, you have quantity demanded, right? Easy. Let's write that as well, right? You have price and cost on the y-axis, and you have quantity demanded on the quantity demanded of the good on the x-axis. Okay, after making the demand curve, then you have to draw other curves, right? So the first one that you will draw here is your marginal revenue. Now, students, have a look at this. Now, the shape of the marginal revenue is not like the usual marginal revenue that we saw in other markets, right? So your marginal revenue, let's draw it like this. Your marginal revenue comes a straight line to the left of your demand curve. It's a straight line that goes like this, right? Just a second, right? It's a straight line that comes like this up till the part, right? Just a second. It's a straight line, yeah. So it's a straight line marginal revenue that comes straight up till this part where there's a kink in the demand curve, right? And then there is a discontinuity, right? So up till this part, you can see it's a straight line, right? And then you will see some discontinuity in the marginal revenue, right? There will be some discontinuity in the marginal revenue, right? And then it will resume later on, right? So this thing, right? This thing is your marginal revenue, right? Now, let me remove this extra things, right? So this is your marginal revenue. It comes straight. Look at this one more time, right? So it comes straight till there's a kink in your demand curve, right? And this is connected over here, right? It comes straight till the part where there's a kink in demand curve, then there is some discontinuity, and then it resumes later on. So this is your marginal revenue, right? Is it making sense, students? Okay. Now, after making the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve of oligopoly, the other two graphs are the same. The marginal cost graph is the same, right? I told you that the marginal cost for any business is always this J-shaped graph, which is upward sloping. So this is your marginal cost. And then the last graph that you need to add to this is your average total cost, which is always U-shaped, right? You would know, right? Just like any other market structure, right? So this is your ATC, average total cost, right? We good on this? Okay. Now, students, let's do the analysis of this oligopoly. Let's do the analysis of this graph. Okay. Now, what is profit maximization output for any firm? So we do know that profit maximization is where the marginal revenue is equals to marginal cost. Yes or no, right? Very good. So think about this. This is your marginal cost. This is your marginal revenue, right? So where the green and this pink line are intersecting. So technically it's intersecting at this point. So all you have to do is to put a dot over there and then bring a dotted line down, connected to the x-axis, and label it as QP, because this is your profit maximization quantity, right? Okay. Now what you need to do next, that you extend this profit maximization point up to the point where this touches with your ATC, right? So you extend this profit maximization point up to your ATC to see how much it costs you to produce a typical unit of the good, right? And then what you do is you simply connect it to the y-axis to see how much it costs you to produce a typical unit of the good. And this is your average total cost, the cost of producing a typical unit of the good. Then you extend this line further, this dotted line further, up till it intersects it will be intersecting at this point, right? Where it intersects with your price, demand curve. And then you connect it to the y-axis to know how much is the price of each unit of the good, right? So P1 is showing you the price for which you're selling the good for. Let's assume a value here, right? So let's say it's worth 100 rupees per liter of oil or whatever, right? And the cost that it takes the business to produce each liter is, let's say, 80 rupees, right? Now 100 minus 80 is 20 rupees. So per unit profit that this company is making is 20 rupees per liter, right? And multiplied by the quantity that you're producing, let's say 500 units or whatever, quantity of good is, then that area, this shaded area, the area of this rectangle will show you the amount of profit that this oligopoly firm will make, right? So this area that I'm shading here is showing you the amount of profit that this oligopoly firm will make. Is this making sense? Right. All firms earn abnormal profits in short run and in long run. Yes, that's correct. Right? So all firms in oligopoly markets will make abnormal profit. Easy? Is it making sense? Right. Okay. Now, students, let's, looking at the graph, let's move to the question, right? Right. Let's do a question here.
Yes. The profit will be calculated. Sorry, could you please go back to the graph?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so the profit will be calculated how?
So profit, basically what is profit? Revenue minus cost, right? Now think about this. The only difference is that here we do not have to calculate the total amount of revenue and total amount of cost before we take the difference, right? So have a look at this. Profit for any business is simply its revenue, how much you earn from the sale of your good, minus how much it costs you to produce that product. Yes or no? Now what we are doing in this case, we are first calculating profit per unit. What do we mean by profit per unit? How much you sell each unit of the good for, which is your price per unit, right? Minus how much it costs you to produce each unit, cost per unit and price per unit. That's what we're looking at. So the price per unit, have a look at this. So price per unit is where this profit maximization quantity is cutting with your demand curve, right? And this is your price per unit, which we assumed to be 100 rupees per liter or whatever, right? And where this profit maximization quantity, you can see where this profit maximization quantity intersects with your ATC, which is the average cost of producing a good, is at this level where it's equal to 80, right? So 100 minus 80 gives you how much? 20 rupees per unit. Is it making sense? Right? So 20 rupees per unit, you make profit. Is it making sense or not?
It is.
Okay. And then times how much quantity you are selling, quantity sold, how much quantity you are selling. So we assume the quantity to be 500. So very simply speaking, we are basically just calculating the area of this rectangle, because the length of this, what is the area of this rectangle? Breadth, which is showing you how much quantity you are selling, times the length, which is showing you profit per unit. So the area of this rectangle is your total profit that this oligopoly firm will make. That's all, right? MC is only variable cost or includes fixed? No, it doesn't include fixed cost. Think about this. Marginal cost is basically the cost of producing an additional unit of the good, right? So marginal cost is how much is the change in your total cost, right, due to change in output. Now you tell me, when you produce one more unit of good, do you incur fixed cost? The rent will stay the same. So it's just like saying that if I get one more student on mega lecture in my class, then whether my rent will increase. No, the rent that we're paying in our office, that will stay the same. The electricity expense that we're paying will stay the same. Everything will stay the same, except for variable cost. And what are those variable costs? With every additional student that we get in our classes, we might be paying more wages or salaries to our teachers, because to incentivize them. More students mean more wages and salaries for our teachers, right? It might mean more electricity expense. I don't know, I'm just making, or more internet charges. Why? Because if there are more students in the class, then I might need some more reliable internet. Internet charges might increase as I'm getting more students, right? And things like that, right? So it's only the variable cost. So if we produce after that, fixed cost will also rise. I mean, later on, it does. Yeah. But for simple explanation, what you need to know that variable cost mainly includes marginal cost, mainly includes your variable cost only. You good on this? Right? Okay. Now, students, let's come to this question, right? Can you see my screen? You cannot, just a second. So is everything clear? Amna, breathe. Okay. Now this is this question for 25 marks. Now, before we start this question, let me quickly tell you that I did say in last class, market structure is a very important, the additional fixed cost as well. Yeah, that's correct, Preet. Now, market structures are a very important topic from exam point of view, and every year we see a major essay question, right? 125 marks essay question related to this topic, right? So that's why we spent so much time revising this. Now let's try to attempt one question today, and then we'll do few more tomorrow so that we get a good hold of it. Now the question here says, discuss similarities and differences between firms' behavior in perfect competition and oligopoly. Now by this time you should be clear that how will you structure your answer. How will you structure your answer? So if let's say this is the question that you want to attempt, it talks about similarly, it's very simply asks you to identify similarities and differences between perfect competition and oligopoly. Now, if you can quickly tell me that how you will write an answer to this, or what components will you include in your answer? Yeah, I'm waiting. So what should you include?
You start off by defining what is perfect competition and oligopoly.
Right, great, correct. What else?
And then move on to what perfect competition is graphically, and then explain that graph, and then do the same for oligopoly, and then the similarities, and then state the differences as we go along.
Correct, correct, absolutely right. So what you have to do is to simply first start off by defining the two market structures, right? What is perfect competition? And while you're defining these structures, it's important that you discuss their characteristics, right? Like what characteristics these market structures have, right? Then after that, a good way would be to make their graphs. Now for graphs, I've already explained you that since the question was not saying that with the help of diagrams or graphs, so you're free whether you want to make it or not, but it's recommended if you make it because you'll get some extra credit for that, right? So after you have, right, I mean, advantages, more than advantages and disadvantages, Preet, you just need to list similarities and differences. Let me explain you how that will be, right? So what is perfect competition? What is oligopoly, right? What are their characteristics? Then you jump to the graph, you show what happens in perfect competition in short run, because we do know that the short run, long run is different in perfect competition, right? So you do mention that in short run, firms in perfect competition make abnormal profit, right? In long run, they make normal profit, and this thing. Then when you move towards oligopoly, you just need to make one graph. Why? Because we do looked at right now, and we saw that in oligopoly, the short and long run stays the same, right? And firms in oligopoly market only make what? They only make normal profit, or sorry, abnormal profit. They constantly make a normal profit because competition is not that much and profit levels stay high. So that's the first difference, right? Then other differences you must have mentioned along the way, that there are much more firms in perfect competition. There are much more firms in perfect competition compared to oligopoly. There are no entry barriers. There are no entry barriers in perfect competition, whereas there are high entry barriers in oligopoly. There is no element of collusion in perfect competition. Firms in perfect competition don't collude. Now, what is collusion? That will be a new topic within this answer that you need to explain, right? But collusion does take place in oligopoly, right? Right. Yeah, we haven't done profits. Yes, Amna. So I'll explain you when we redo the syllabus. I'll explain you in detail that what's the difference between normal and abnormal profit, right? That's also part of our syllabus. But before that, if you want to, understand that. So the class is ending, students. You can just quickly join. I will not stretch it above 8 p.m. So just quickly join the class again.